A couple of things I wanted to say about our next presenter. First, I'm pretty certain he traveled the furthest to get here. Tony Smith, who made the journey from autumn in Hobart to come to spring in Seattle. So is there any difference in weather? Yes. No. And we're really delighted that Tony accepted our invitation. As you'll see, the Australians are taking a very different and very innovative approach to dealing with ecosystem-based fisheries management, and Tony has really been a key part of the vision that has built that. So very happy to have him here. So thanks, Tony.
Thank you, and thanks to all the organisers and organising committee for the opportunity to be here. I spent about 5 months at SAFS over a decade ago now, and it's always nice to come back again. I'm not going to be presumptuous enough to offer you advice on what you should do with your Magnuson reauthorization, but what I will try and do is just give you a sort of a whirlwind tour of what our experience has been with EBFM in Australia, and perhaps at the end look at some comparisons between our different systems. So specifically what I'll try and do is I'll just give you a very quick précis about our oceans and fisheries to set a bit of context. Very briefly talk about some of the policy drivers that have driven this approach in Australia. Probably spend, because I'm a scientist and develop tools, spend a fair bit of time talking about the kind of tools that we've developed to support EBFM, talk a little bit about how the implementation has actually gone, and then some successes and failures and lessons. So Australia is bounded by three different oceans and spans from, like the US, from tropical to sort of sub-Antarctic waters. So you know, it's quite diverse in terms of its ecosystems. The Australian fishing industry is fisheries and aquaculture is worth about a bit over $2 billion a year, so considerably smaller than in the US. That's actually one of the key points here. Where's the pointer? Is that the total tonnage removal of the wild catch fishery is in the order of 160 to 180,000 tonnes. Now, Australia has the third largest EEZ in the world, so that's a very small catch, and right from the outset, our sort of ecosystem footprint, if you like, of fishing is relatively small. So we're kind of in a good place there. The interesting thing is that the majority of the value of our fisheries are in invertebrate fisheries. Some of the policy drivers, the whole sustainable development, Brundtland report kind of thing generated, and then Rio and so on, generated a big focus on what we came to call ecologically sustainable development. That was adopted by all governments in Australia in the early 90s. And then there were a series of sort of developments from that, new fisheries legislation, Australia's oceans policy in the late 90s, and the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, which is kind of our equivalent of your NEPA, again in the late 90s. There was an explicit agreement to pursue an EBFM approach, again by both federally and in our state fisheries in the early 2000s, and then a number of other things since then, which you're probably not very interested in. Ecosystem-based fisheries management, I'm going to cover a number of these kind of elements in the rest of the talk. So as several, almost all speakers have said, both in this session and previous ones, that sort of target species, primary resource focused harvest strategies are front and centre of effective ecosystem-based fisheries management. So you've got to manage your resources properly in the first place. I'm going to talk a bit about then broadening the focus to look at impacts on other parts of the ecosystem, both through ecological risk assessment, and talk a little bit about spatial management, and then a fair bit about this idea of whole of fishery management strategy evaluation. So not using MSE not just to test and formulate robust harvest strategies, but much more broadly to look at how we manage all those sort of ecological and social and economic consequences of fishing. So this is a figure that probably some of you have seen before. It was a sort of a framework that we came up with almost a decade ago to try and think about this idea of the scientific tools that you need to support EBFM. And the tools themselves are the familiar ones that we've just heard about in the last two talks. You know, the importance of monitoring, assessment, decision making, decision support. The scope is, you know, from individual populations and stocks out through the ecosystem and right out to the sort of full socio-economic system. I guess the key thing about this figure though is the kind of types of tools from sort of qualitative expert base through empirical to model base. And so what we set about doing was saying, well, we already have some of these tools, so stock assessment would be an assessment method at the population level, mostly using model base, for example, but we wanted to essentially populate this whole space and have tools that were available to us to do that. So I'm going to just start off talking a little bit about harvest strategies. We had a national sort of approach to that in the mid-2000s. The core elements were to maintain stocks at ecologically sustainable levels. Within that context, to maximise economic returns to the Australian community and to adopt formal harvest strategies for key commercial species. And you'll have seen, so these are sort of some of the harvest control rule type formulations that you've seen lots of examples of from a number of the speakers. The key point being that our target fishing mortality rate is FMEY rather than something else. And some fairly conservative, we had something like a 40-20 rule rather than a 40-10 or 45 rule. And we had explicit, in the policy, explicit risk criteria saying that the risk of falling below these sort of thresholds had to be at a suitably low level, about 10%. Another element of the approach to harvest strategies was a tiered approach, which in part we borrowed from this part of the world. We've obviously sort of adopted those sort of approaches. But it does raise this issue that there are choices to be made in, so the tiers go from where you have robust stock assessments through to maybe only trends in catch rates, and we're actually currently exploring a lot of these data poor methods that there's also been a fair bit of discussion about. So there are sort of further tiers here. The point being that there are sort of management trade-offs to be made about acceptable levels of risk, which are defined for us, and then how hard you push the system and how costly the investment has to be in both research, assessment and management to kind of justify the risks that you're taking. Some of the outcomes of adopting the harvest strategy policy in the mid-2000s was a very rapid decline in the amount of overfishing and a slightly more gradual decline in the number of overfished stocks. Again, as we've seen elsewhere in examples that we've seen in this conference. So in terms of this is a slight sort of redrawing of that three-dimensional figure I showed before in our tools, but you know, so we're now looking at assessments and both empirical and model-based assessments. So we've got a number of tools that were developed to kind of support that part of the process. I'm now going to move to ecological risk assessment, which we invested heavily in the early 2000s. We ended up coming up or devising this sort of framework, which was actually a series of methods that are applied at a series of different levels, 1, 2 and 3. And the methods themselves move from qualitative through to much more quantitative. And it's essentially, I think Steve Cadron used the term triage, and that's exactly what this is. It's a process of prioritising, looking very comprehensively at all possible risks in a qualitative way, so it's fairly rapid and easy to do, screening out the low risks and only further considering those that came out high. You can then either move immediately to some sort of management response or go to the next a sort of assessment level and so on down this sort of hierarchy. So it's an efficient way of using scarce resources, and you're moving from sort of less certain to more certain assessments of impact. The actual, at each level, there's a particular method. This is the qualitative one. The main point of this slide is simply to say that you can focus on target species, bycatch species, protected species, habitats and ecological communities. The level 2 assessment came to be called productivity susceptibility analysis, essentially screening, in this case, bycatch species in a trawl fishery. These are individual species ranked from sort of low risk to high risk on both a productivity and a susceptibility measure. And again, it's a sort of a screening process to rapidly identify the species that you should be more concerned about. We develop methods to essentially use the same approach for habitats, different sorts of seabed types. And then, the overall idea is that, for example, your level 1 analysis might have found no species that had high risk scores, no habitats that had high risk scores and no bycatch, and so those got screened out at that level. You go to the next level for the target species, the TEP species and the communities, and then potentially again screening to find the individual species or communities that might need a fully quantitative evaluation. So back to this sort of our tools framework slide. So this is the ecological risk assessment, which can apply at both the population and the ecosystem level, and at all three sort of methods, the sort of level 1, level 2, level 3 kind of methods. So now I'm just going to say a little bit about management strategy evaluation. I think this is quite similar to your slide, Anne. We probably both borrowed it from Beth Fulton. But basically the idea is that you're looking at alternative management strategies across a range of objectives, and the idea is to ultimately look at the trade-offs. But we start off with a model of the ecosystem here, and then this is the sort of observation, monitoring process, assessment, decision-making, implementation, and the actual prosecution of the fishery or other human activity. And sort of this is the adaptive management cycle that's being looked at. So just to flesh out one particular example, this was for our southeastern fisheries, where we developed this Atlantis model as the sort of tool to do the management strategy evaluation. So we start off with the underlying sort of physical environment, the currents and the water temperatures and so on. We build in the sort of trophic food web and the habitats and so on. We then add in the sort of industries, the fishing activities. In this particular case, there were are sort of line fisheries and trawl fisheries and pot fisheries and so on, as well as some recreational fisheries. We then look at the sort of socio-economic factors, the costs of fishing, the markets, the quota trading networks. So we're starting to model kind of the human elements of the system there, and then finally to the sort of management process itself and the decision making. So in this particular case, we kind of looked at a number of different management strategies based around broad scenarios, and these were a sort of a status quo strategy, so the way the fishery was managed at the time. We did this back in the mid-2000s. We looked at increasing the number of quota species, at a more integrated management approach using various spatial management and gear controls and so on, a strongly conservation-driven strategy, and a sort of a fifth one, which is a little bit like this one. And then what you do is use the model to evaluate the trade-offs, essentially. So we had objectives that were based around economic objectives, ecological objectives, industry concerns, management processes, management costs, and so on. And this is a sort of a simple summary of the performance across a range of different objectives of each of those different strategies that we evaluated. And you can see that, well, one of the features is that no single strategy does best against all objectives, but a couple of them did rather better than average on a number of the performance measures. One of the interesting things here is that, I mean, this was essentially the strategy that was in place when we started the study, and by the time we'd finished the study, they'd pretty much adopted this strategy here. So this was an example where it actually had, you know, it wasn't just a kind of a theoretical exercise and hand over a report. There was a huge amount of stakeholder engagement through the process and resulted in big changes in the fishery. Just a number of you know this, but Atlantis has sort of taken off in its own right. There's lots of Atlantis models now developed around Australia, one being developed for the Southern Ocean, and actually a number around this part of the world as well. So one thing I didn't mention, so we're now talking about the tool of management strategy evaluation. We're actually looking at strategies that span from individual populations out through ecosystems and even into sort of socioeconomics. And we did actually undertake a purely qualitative MSE, but then this quantitative one using the Atlantis model. Okay, just, you know, we've developed a number of other sorts of models in terms of the biological complexity, physical complexity, and human complexity. One of the key ones that's sort of new is MICE, which stands for Models of Intermediate Complexity for Ecosystems, to be contrasted with CATS, which are complex assessment tools. We sort of have fun with acronyms. This is I think Anne referred to minimum realistic models, so this is essentially the same thing. These are models that can be fitted to data. They're simple enough to fit to data, but they're actually starting to pick up some of the ecological interactions that can be important. So there's a big investment in those as well. So I guess the key concepts underlying the tools development, I mean, there are a number of them there. Probably the key ones I've highlighted are this idea of a sort of a hierarchical structuring to tools that allows a sort of a triage approach to sort of prioritise what you should be looking at and managing, a risk-based approach, and quite a lot of attention now on data poor and poor data methods, and having a diversity of tools in the toolbox. In terms of implementing EBFM in Australia, I obviously the harvest strategy policy has led to a reduction in overfishing. I'll show you that in a minute. Implementing the policy has also reduced fleet sizes, fishing effort, and therefore ecological footprints. There have been a variety of measures to deal with species that have been identified as high risk, be they bycatch or protected species. And one of the other big changes has really been a large increase in the use of spatial management. There's just a couple of figures here. So this is in terms of trawl fisheries, at least in the year 2000, there were some closures already in place. By 2009, those were the trawl closures, essentially. So a lot of spatial management. Further even to that period, but not, so this is a combination of marine protected areas for biodiversity management, but all the red areas are essentially closures under fishery management regulations. Australia in 2012 implemented a system of offshore marine reserve networks, and that's basically what it looked like. Now, not all of those areas are necessarily closed to fishing. Some of them are multiple use, but essentially there's a fairly, there's been a big change in spatial management. In terms of successes, so if we go back to this southeast fishery that I mentioned before, this is at the sort of aggregate harvest rate level across the 30 or 40 species in the groundfish fishery. Over time, you can see that the exploitation rate was increasing. This was the period when the harvest strategies were brought into play, and you can see a reduction. What I haven't got a figure for, but is equally important, is that the economic performance of the fishery really turned around during this period as well. So it's economically a lot more healthy. Its trawl footprint has reduced substantially. There's a number of other kind of benefits that have gone with that. MSC, Marine Stewardship Council certification, there have been a number of fisheries certified under that scheme in Australia. One of them was a tropical shrimp fishery, the northern prawn fishery, which Andre knows a lot about because he does assessments in it. And that's kind of interesting in the sense that it's there's a huge bycatch issue in that fishery. The bycatch is about 10 times at least the retained catch, but nonetheless it managed to achieve certification because there'd been a lot of work done to assess the sustainability of that bycatch, and in some cases a lot of measures brought in to reduce bycatch. One of our big failures, this is a sort of a morality tale really. Once upon a time we had a nice little fishery which was called the small pelagic fishery. It had harvest strategies in place. It had very precautionary ones that took account of ecosystem effects, and it had good monitoring and all the rest of it. But it was economically, not performing very well, and so the quota owners pooled together and decided to bring in a boat that could actually process the catch and be economically more productive and efficient. And they chose this particular vessel, the Marguerite. They went through about a 3-year period of seeking and getting all the approvals to have the boat operate in the fishery. And it actually arrived in Australia, and then through an alliance, somewhat unusual alliance because they normally don't work very well together, but of ENGOs and the recreational fishing lobby, and an extremely effective social media campaign that was just really had to be seen to be believed. The fishery and this particular vessel were all over the front page of all of our national papers for about a week and a half. It's the only time in my entire experience that fisheries has achieved that sort of prominence. These were some of the sort of cartoons that that came out through the process. The amount of misinformation was also pretty startling. But the net result was that the particular vessel was banned from fishing. The federal government initially sort of supported the process they'd already been through to say it was fine for it to fish. They actually had to change their own legislation to ban the fishing, ban the boat. So I guess the point of this is that you can do all the right things and still, if you lose the social licence to operate, a term that's often used, you can be in big trouble. As I said, I'm not really going to try and be presumptuous enough to talk about lessons for your reauthorisation, but just to reflect on, out of what I've heard from the talks to date, some of the similarities and differences. Clearly there are a lot of similarities in particularly the approach to tools and management, especially I think to the US West Coast. That part, there's good reasons for that. There's a lot of, I've called it cultural interchange, but I come here a fair bit. Andre comes to Australia. We've got a lot of student exchange. There's a lot of meetings that Anne and a lot of the people here, Jimmy and Ellie and others, Anna Palmer, those approaches are sort of common currency. There are also, I think, some substantial differences in the sort of a whole approach to legislation and policy. So one of the things that really strikes me as a contrast between your system and ours, at least, is that for us legislation is important, but it's less primary. There's a lot more that's done through policy that sort of sits within a kind of a broad legislative framework. And I actually think it probably gives us a bit more flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. We certainly don't have to reauthorise our Fisheries Acts every 7 to 10 years. So that's a difference, but not something that you can do anything about, I suspect. There are some similarities and differences also in some of the companion legislation. As I said, our EPBC Act is very similar to your NEPA, but again, what it doesn't require is a 7,000-page environmental impact statement. And I think it has many of the same kind of beneficial effects that have also been spoken about, but again, without being quite so onerous in terms of the amount of work that it takes to meet the requirements. And then the final, couple of points. Again, I'd sort of stress the importance, there's probably more back to the tools of the sort of triage approach, attempts to prioritise issues, risk-based approaches and so on. And just noting that, we do share a lot of the tools in common. There's a lot of two-way or multi-way interaction in that, and the sort of toolbox we end up with is well stocked, but not necessarily with sausages. So thanks very much. This is just a final slide to note some of my collaborators, by no means all of them, but also this is our research laboratories in Hobart, and visitors are always welcome.